let's start with a brief introduction of yourselves and your role within this project. So you can also optionally touch on what drew you to research this in the first place.
I think I'll probably start this one first. I think we're all going to address this one, but since among this group, I'm the one who got things most started. So Lee Humberg is the State Director of Wildlife Services in Indiana. And he's on campus here at Purdue. He interacts with our wildlife faculty. And for a couple of years, he's been talking about this problem because his office was until very recently, when the Farm Bureau changed the rules, the office that would be dealing with the permitting from the federal side to deal with vulture problems. And a while ago now, time passes, he worked within his agency, USDA Wildlife Services, to get in touch with their research wing and sort of got the ball rolling on creating a research project to address this need. And Dr. Brian Kluver is the lead from their research group in his agency that reached out to me to say, we have this problem. We're wanting to find a graduate student and really start to address this problem. So that's what brought this onto all of my radar. Lee and Brian, and then Dr. Grant Burcham from the Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab at the Southern Indiana Purdue Ag Center, because Grant had been working with Lee on sort of doing some sort of preliminary pilot studies with necropsy stuff already. We advertised, and when we sent our advertisement out, Marian was the candidate we selected to become the PhD student to take this project on. So I'll pass the ball on to Marian then.
Yeah, so I'm Marian. I'm a PhD student here on this project. I'm working on a whole bunch of kind of interdisciplinary approaches to this problem. So we're incorporating some social science stuff, movement tracking, our veterinary necropsy stuff, some experimental mitigation stuff so that we can look at what works or doesn't work very well in all sorts of different circumstances to protect livestock and vultures. And what drew me to this project is largely the fact that I'm an enormous vulture nerd. But I'm also very interested in this. In order to conserve really anything, we need to balance human needs with the needs of wildlife. And I think this is a really interesting project for looking at that angle of things.
I think, yeah, Dr. Ma, you'd be the next one in this timeline.
It goes clockwise on my screen. Sure. So I will just introduce myself. My name is Zhao Ma. I'm a professor and a natural resource social scientist in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at Purdue, right? So my research mostly focuses on how individuals and organizations make resource management and conservation decisions. And I try to use different theories and methods to understand factors that influence human environmental interactions, right? And that's exactly what this project is about, right? It's about vultures and ranchers and livestock producers and their interactions. So it's really something very interesting to me. But personally, what really drew me to this project is because of Brooke Mcquirter, who's going to introduce herself in a minute. She's my PhD student, and just because of her passion for human environmental conflict and particular human wildlife interactions, and she's really excited about this project, and that's why I'm worked out a process with Pat and actually developed the social component of the project. So Brooke is really the brain behind the social science component.
Yeah, my name is Brooke Mcquirter. I'm a PhD candidate in Dr. Ma's lab. And so I'm also a natural resource social scientist, and I'm really interested in how we think about risk perception and trust, particularly in human wildlife interactions. And I think that includes both conflict and coexistence considerations, right? And yes, I did my bachelor's in wildlife biology, so I'm always looking for opportunities to interact with that side of my studies and how we can interact more with the social side, the human dimensions of human wildlife conflict. And so when I heard about this project and then they were looking to maybe expand on the social science component of it, I leaped on it, and I've been very fortunate to be part of such a great team.
So exciting. Thank you again for making time to chat with me about it. As I kind of mentioned in my emails, I was very moved by the press coverage of your research in black vultures and livestock depredation. in an effort to learn more about it, but also teach our community more about it. I am so appreciative that I have this opportunity to speak with you. So would you mind briefly breaking down these different moving parts, like the GPS transmitting, recording vulture feeding patterns, the farmer surveys, the necropsies, and what you hope to learn from them?
Yeah, so the nature of the problem is such that we really need this multifaceted interdisciplinary approach to understand it completely, and then to find ways of balancing the vultures and the farmers. So one of the things, the first thing that we're working on is our necropsy work. So we have no real criteria right now to identify when an animal has been killed by vultures, as opposed to some other cause of death, or if it's just been scavenged immediately after death. So our goal is to look at animals that farmers give to us that have been killed by black vultures, and then compare those to stillborn calves that we've been setting up in a little vulture restaurant, so that we can see what things look like under the two different circumstances. The next part is the GPS tracking. We've got 21 little GPS solar powered backpacks out on birds right now. And it gives us something like on average of like 100 or more fixes per day. So we get these little maps of all of these little points where the vultures are going. And then we can use that to look at things that habitat types they really like, or habitat types that they don't like. Do they spend a lot of time near roads because that's where they can find roadkill? Are they going for cattle ranches that are really close to water or not close to water, so we can identify risk factors and just the movement biology of the vultures? And then the final component of this is the social science work. And the social science work has kind of two components to it. We really have surprisingly little information on the extent of the problem. We have no information on that in the Midwest, essentially whatsoever. So one of the goals of these farmer surveys is just to get an idea of the scope of the problem, how many farmers are losing animals, how many animals they're losing, look for things like farm characteristics that might be associated. Do really large farmers have issues as opposed to much smaller farmers? And then the second part of the social science work is Brooke's whole aspect of it. So I'm going to hand this over to her.
The second part is kind of looking at, when we think about human wildlife conflict, oftentimes there is that kind of economic consideration. How much are they losing? But there can be a lot of other factors involved with conflict. And these can be ranging from the values that we hold when we think about how we should handle wildlife, how our place with wildlife, to who we trust. Do we trust organizations to manage wildlife appropriately or take our voices into account? And even like our non-tangible experiences. How do we feel when we have them? What are the types of experiences we've had with black vultures, which I'm sure you have interacted with a lot doing education, right? And so a negative experience can carry a long way in how I feel about the animal and my tolerance of that animal on my property. And so this side of the social science of our surveys, which Marian and I did together, is measuring what are the drivers of tolerance when we take into account all these other factors that we know can influence how people think about it, tolerate wildlife. What is driving tolerance within this context? And how can that maybe help us think about some other ways that can help address this conflict beyond trying to address the economic considerations, the physical costs associated with vultures?
Maybe I would just expand that a little bit, right? Because this interaction between vultures and livestock producers are not just unique to this particular situation, right? Mm-hmm. This kind of human-wildlife interactions and the dynamics actually happen with many resource users and with many different wildlife species, right? So in the literature, it seems pretty clear the economic and ecological factors are influencing these interactions. But what Brooke and I are really interested in are these social, political, cultural, and institutional factors that also influencing these interactions, right? Which may lead to conflict, or we hope it may also lead to coexistence, right? One of the example I would give is when I worked on rancher-wolf interactions in the American West. One of the things we heard repeatedly is ranchers are, very concerned and in fact quite unsatisfied how their voices they feel their voices were never captured by conservation organizations or federal and state agencies that managing wolves, right? So they have all these very legitimate concerns, whether or not wolf really killed a particular animal on their ranch, or they feel like, they feel the stress and the worry associated watching wolf, going around their ranch, right? These kind of tangible or intangible feelings, right, emotions and perceptions are, all very real and affect how people feel about the situation, right? So they sometimes, at least the stories I heard from ranchers is they feel scientists or management agencies tend to use the data they captured, but they don't really care what stories or feelings or emotions or stress that they're having in their day-to-day life, right? So the same thing with Black Vulture and livestock producer, their interactions. So one of the things we're really hoping to do through the survey is actually give livestock producer opportunity to voice their concerns and then eventually take that into consideration for the broader project. And then hopefully we'll, whatever we find will be used to inform the next step of vulture conservation programs or programs that targeting livestock producers to help them cope with, the increasing number of vultures.
All right, before I go to my wrap up, I'm gonna just prompt Marian, because you alluded to the mitigation work in your response to question 1, but you didn't talk about your chapter 4 at all when you were talking about the various prongs. So you should talk about the mitigation work a little bit before I give a wrap up here.
Right, so the final aspect of this is looking at ways that we can protect livestock by essentially keeping vultures away from vulnerable animals at the times that they're most a threat to these animals. There are a number of established techniques that exist for keeping vultures away, things like effigies. So hanging either a dead vulture or a fake dead vulture, it sends the signal to the other birds like, hey, this is a dangerous place to be. We should go forage somewhere else. There are things like firecrackers and lasers that you can use to disperse a roost, but we don't have a whole lot of data on what works well or poorly in what different circumstances. And in particular, we don't have any data whatsoever on how it really changes foraging patterns on any kind of detailed scale. So there's a very reasonable concern that if you disperse a roost using any of these techniques, do the birds actually avoid that particular farm now, or have they just moved to a roost that's 1.5 miles down the road and they're just commuting in from a slightly different location? So because we have all of this really detailed GPS data, we can do something like disperse a roost and see whether that is actually effective at changing the foraging behavior of the birds.
So that's the final prong of what we're committed to, although we have a lot of tangent ideas that we're excited about as well too. So that's the big picture vision for all of the elements. And my wrap up here is to stress that all of these elements are critically important to approach from a scientific perspective, to actually gather data and objectively analyze that data to draw conclusions. Because underlying, as we've worked in this system for 1.75 years now or whatever, it's very apparent that underlying this from all sides, there are a lot of people who have decided that they know what's going on. Mm-hmm. And these are people on both sides of the fence, but it's inference from anecdote. It's not inference from, objectively collected and analyzed data at all. So, it's sort of circling back to Zhao's point, that doesn't devalue people's perceptions at all, but there is a strong need, whether it's a conservation biologist who's giving an interview to the media sort of saying, oh, there's no real problem here at all, because the only animals that are being killed are, animals that had comorbidities that were going to die already anyways, or it's producers who feel like their voices aren't being heard. We need to have objective data, and all these prongs are important ways of understanding what's going on in this system. And that to me is what's critical about this, is before we start advocating for actions, that we actually gather data and analyze it to define, to understand what's really going on in the system before we start envisioning actions to move forward to address problems that are not really truly understood in an objective way.
Yeah, and that's something that kind of stood out to me about your approach to this massive project, is the fact that, you know, we've heard from local farmers here that they're nuisances, and there's a lot of defensiveness that I've encountered even within the conservation circle that kind of resists that. I'm not speaking for like anyone on staff here necessarily, but just like the overall landscape of the ongoing zeitgeist about the situation unfolding with Black vultures. But there's so much that we don't know. To Marian's point about the roosting behavior, a lot of the old techniques for dispersing roosts were complicated from the articles that I was reading by the fact that they seem to have like a network system and might just be moving to a different roost site, but still coming and loafing on the property where the rancher has concerns about them and the welfare of their animals. So it's a very difficult conflict to approach, because of course, like the livestock ranchers are very invested in their cattle. They want them to be safe and they want their voices to be heard. But, you know, we also have to be cautious about conserving vultures and ensuring that we don't enter into a vulture crisis of our own here in North America. Which kind of flows into my next question, which is kind of twofold. So we can probably address it one at a time, but what's at stake for vultures and ranchers and these increasing reports of human-wildlife conflict?
As you alluded to earlier, a lot of vultures across the world, particularly in Africa and the Indian subcontinent, are critically endangered and have declining populations. There's really a vulture crisis going on. We are extremely fortunate here in North America that our vulture populations are doing really well. We have, in the US, we have black vultures and turkey vultures, which are both, at the very least, populations are stable and for the most part, depending on the area, actually growing a little bit. Of course, that leads to our problem of them moving here into the Midwest and having this new problem that farmers are having to deal with that has only developed over the past couple decades. We also have California condors, which are one of the big vulture success stories so far. There were only 21 individuals at one point, and now we have hundreds of them. So overall in the US, our vulture situation is really fantastic. But we really, really don't want to end up in one of these vulture crisis situations. Vultures are really amazing birds and really important to the environment, both just for the nutrient cycling and the balance of our ecosystem. But from a human perspective as well, they have absolutely iron stomachs. They clean up all of the roadkill, and their stomachs can kill anthrax and botulism. So they also really can reduce livestock diseases as well. So there's a lot of benefit to having these birds, and we want to make sure that their populations stay healthy. At the same time, we do need to protect the livestock producers. A lot of the people here in Indiana have, it's not their prime source of income. We have a lot of small producers. So losing just one animal has a really large financial cost to them. And then in addition to that, there's a substantial emotional cost when you go out to check on your animals and you find a calf that's been killed by vultures and it has, its eyes and tongue missing and blood pooled on the ground. It's not exactly a emotionally easy sight. So what we're looking to do is find ways to protect livestock by keeping vultures away from them. And by doing that, we also end up protecting vultures. If we make them not a threat to livestock, then we can focus on the rest of the conservation aspects of it. We really want to create a situation here where everybody wins.
Beyond what Marian said, I would emphasize that culturally in North America, at the very least, vultures already face some degree of stigma. They're scavengers. They have an atypical appearance. I mean, these are wonderful adaptations to have no feathers on your head. But it probably biases people to have negative perceptions of them to some degree already. And while neither of our vulture species are in any danger of their populations really truly being threatened right now, there is a sort of the PR aspect for the vultures. To have them be an understood species is a fair concern. Like Marian said, that they provide important ecosystem services. They're valuable elements of the natural world. You know, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the parts. You know, we can't claim to understand the complexity of an ecosystem. So we're never probably ever going to end up getting rid of all the vultures around us. And that's a good thing, like Marian said, but it's important that we have solid knowledge and that we use that solid knowledge to help people understand values and to help people understand risks on both sides of this so that we make intelligently informed decisions. So I guess what's at risk for the vultures right now is that they're probably misunderstood because we have so little data, and that can lead to a lot of bad decisions all the way around.
I do want to add as well, something that often gets kind of pushed aside is that vultures are culturally and spiritually significant to different Native American groups across both continents, I believe. So there's a huge amount of value to conserving them just for that reason as well.
Another part is with changing climates and the way wildlife conflicts are just not going to go away, right? And so this process, how are we handling new conflicts and what does that look like? How are we incorporating data and the voices of people involved in these conflicts? I think is on a broader scale also very important, and particularly for livestock producers and farmers who very well may be on the front lines on a lot of these conflicts as they're trying to just maintain their livelihoods in a more complicated, environments.
Maybe just expand on that a little more, right? Kind of thinking about the processes, right? Very often, whenever there's a conflict, environmental human conflict happen, we think, oh, let's educate people, give them more information about what's really happening, or let's pay people, right? Compensate them for their livestock loss. These are all very important tools that we should continue to use. But at the same time, it's very important to understand other factors that influence their attitudes and behaviors, right? Sometimes people decided to do something not because they have really thought through. Sometimes they ask, their fellow resource users, ranchers or farmers what they're, doing, and then they will tend to do the same thing, right? Or if they observe other behavior in terms of addressing vulture rancher concern, they probably will tend to follow the same behavior, right? Within the social sciences, we call these the social norms, right? So social norms play a very important role in influencing people's behavior towards the environment and natural resources, right? That's just one of many examples of factors that's not economic, that's not informational, but it could be very, very powerful in terms of determining this relationship, right, between animal and wildlife and people. So I think for Brooke and I, this particular situation or context is really helpful to study these broader processes and broader factors that influencing human-wildlife interactions in general. So that's also something to consider as well.
Thank you. And just kind of to dig down a little bit more into that, what would you say are some of the social, political, cultural, or economic factors that are influencing this rancher and black vulture conflict?
One of the interesting things with black vultures culturally, as Pat mentioned, right, they don't have the best characterization in our culture. So not only by their appearance, but if we think about cartoons you may have seen or animal villains, vultures are often portrayed as these like evil, hunched creatures, and that you're gonna read that, and that's kind of one thing that you may already assign to them, like unknowingly, right? And then when we think of them in our popular culture and the media and the way they're not described often as scavengers, but sometimes even as like eating animals alive. Or Marian mentioned once that they were called sky wolves, which is kind of attributing this almost like animosity to vultures that can influence people. And then I think politically they are federally protected. And so when we think about the ability of control we have, or livestock producers or any kind of landowner has over animals that they consider pests, when that comes into conflict with regulations and how they feel about the government's role in that process, or their ability to control that problem, can always create tensions that can influence how conflicts are interacted with and how animals are perceived, right? And I think, and then of course, economically, I think Marian can talk more about some of the economic considerations of the vultures, though I think we have mentioned that a few other times as well.
Yeah, so we have a lot of small producers here in the Midwest with fewer than 100 animals. And that means that when you lose just one of your calves, that has a really substantial economic impact. It's, you're losing a really large proportion of the relatively few animals that you raise. And then that's really closely tied into the fact that because a lot of people raise fewer animals, it's both economically important and just emotionally important. There's a lot invested in an individual animal. And we're talking about the loss of one animal means the loss of hundreds or potentially thousands of dollars of income. So it can really have a substantial impact.
Another component of this conflict that we are not focusing on in our research, but it is understood with black vultures, is they can also cause property damage. Mm-hmm. And so livestock producers may actually be dealing with them on two fronts, and then that they may be damaging their property alongside potentially attacking their calves or things like that. And so that is another factor that can influence how that conflict's being perceived and how they may react to seeing them at any situation around their property, because they can potentially have two potential problems at hand when they see them.
I would say at the same time, right, that perceived control is very important in kind of shaping people's, I guess, attitude and behavior towards vultures or black vultures or any other wildlife species, right? If they feel they can do something to protect themselves or to keep the vultures away, they are more likely to be tolerant towards the animal, right? And that perceived control, the key part is perceived, right? Sometimes it's not the actual control people have. Of course, they're all related, but it's the perception of whether or not they could navigate the livestock compensation program easily, right? In order to get financially compensated, can they report a particular problematic vulture easily to the authority? Can they, if they report something, would they be believed, right? Or would they be brushed off to say, oh, this is not happening? Do they have the knowledge or the financial means or the support from neighbors to put up an effigy, right, that may or may not be very pretty, right, on their property? Will they be judged for that, right? So all of these different aspects are part of that perceived control. People, very much value, right, in their day-to-day livestock management, right? And these are all kind of social factors that would affect their interaction with black vultures.
Yeah, this is a bit of a tangent, but we've observed here that a lot of farm bureaus are serving as a sort of intermediary between ranchers and federal TWRA is our local wildlife resources agency, but U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services to kind of expedite the process of getting take permits or to ensure that these ranchers are heard or have access to the laws because it's something that they may not have considered previously. So it's like a very interesting social dynamic of control going on here and how much the ranchers feel that they can depend on government regulations to provide them what they need.
Yeah, so there's been a shift in Indiana towards the same system that Kentucky is using, which is that the State Farm Bureau has a master permit. And then if you're a member of the Farm Bureau, you can go to the Farm Bureau and say, I'm having these problems, and you can become a sub-permittee. So the Farm Bureau has a set number of vultures that they have a permit for, and then they can kind of distribute those out to members. I am really a fan of this kind of system because it means the farmers are being directly involved in it, but through the Farm Bureau, through an organization that they trust over something like the state and federal government. So it makes it easier for farmers to get the support that they need. And it also really means they're being heard by the agency that they're getting the permits through. And they have that sort of increased engagement with the entire process that I think can be incredibly valuable for this.
I think particularly in instances where wildlife conflicts can be rather rural and it hard to track, any chance that you can get livestock producers or farmers engaged in that process reduces the likelihood that they will go ahead and deal with the problem on their own, undocumented. And I think when it comes to monitoring wildlife populations, that can be an extremely important tool for conservation. Is, you know, if you're going to go kill a vulture, it's best that we know about it.
Yeah, exactly. And this is not to say that everyone's going to go out and apply for a permit, right, to do that. But the fact that the procedure is there and is easily accessible and people understand how to do it, that increase their sense of perceived control. And that will, you know, in turn, increase their tolerance, right? So having these kind of streamlined processes out there readily available to people and communicate that process clearly to people will definitely help with the situation.
Another aspect of this is the opportunity to leverage the chance to influence the way that lethal take is happening. Mm-hmm. Because enough permits are never going to be issued to eliminate the population. That, you know, like Brooke mentioned earlier, this is a species protected by an international treaty, the Migratory Bird Treaty. But if we can work with agencies that producers trust to help them to think intelligently about how they use the limited number of permits they have access to fundamentally change bird behavior, then we can decrease what may be a problem much more dramatically than if it's just people going off on their own, doing something and never reporting it. We don't get data on it, and we don't have an opportunity to say, look, you can kill 3 birds a year on your farm. This is when you want to kill them. This is how you want to kill them. This is how you want to coordinate that take with other mitigation measures to have the biggest impact to make your farm safer. Prior to these kinds of programs, that opportunity just didn't exist to engage in helping to think strategically about how to integrate whatever legal take happens into mitigation measures. So there's a really profound opportunity that can grow out of these kinds of programs to like Marian said at the top, to make this a win-win as much as we can for everyone. Obviously, for individual vultures that are being shot, it's not a win for them. For individual producers that lose livestock, it's not a win for them. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of people with very entrenched perspectives right now, and on all the sides, and we need to gather data and use opportunities like this to leverage change moving forward. All of this is really focused on because your original question was like, what are some of the underlying forces here? Mm-hmm. Another aspect of this that we haven't talked about from the biology side of this, that in the southeastern US, producers have a long history of dealing with this problem. Mm-hmm. And black vulture populations have been expanding, growing in numbers and growing in range. So this is a novel conflict in places like Indiana relative to places like Florida, for example. So there is this interaction between what's going on with the biology of the organism, the black vulture. Again, we don't know why. We can come up with hypotheses about changing land use, changing climate, lots of forces that could be related to why black vulture numbers are going up, why they're moving into new areas. We don't have data on that right now. But that is also another important force to point to, that this is not a static system, it's a dynamic system.
Well said. I think we've touched on the sort of balancing act and making this a win-win situation very thoroughly. So I want to kind of move ahead to the something that you touched on just now, Pat, is the fact that these local farm bureaus, these ranchers don't really feel like their voices are heard. And one thing that we've run into is when we do outreach as a conservation organization, we're met with some resistance. So how can conservationists and wildlife organizations like American Eagle Foundation provide compassionate support and resources to farmers and ranchers who are dealing with black vultures and help reinforce that sort of win-win and strategic thinking that we've been talking about?
I mean, to me, you don't start with the problem. You start with building a relationship with a group first, and then that develops a level of trust. So any presumptions about the status that you're being labeled with as a conservation organization are no longer undermining a relationship. So engaging at the level of, this is a problem and this is what you need to do differently, doesn't create dialogue. So to me, the first thing is developing relationships with producers independent of this issue, and then moving from there to sort of look for where these opportunities to find these win-win solutions where things can be improved for vultures and producers at the same time.
I absolutely agree with Pat, right? That relationship building is just so important. And also something Marian said earlier, right? So doing all this research and we can confirm how many of the perceived kills, black vulture kills, are actual black vulture kills, or if they were, already kind of dead and then black vulture, kind of came after, right? So there will be real data that can be shown to kind of figure out the extent of the problem, right, from that side. But even if we show, really black vulture didn't do any kill, it's all, afterwards, right? You don't want to go to a communication or outreach event with the mentality you're going to tell people the truth, right? What the actual science data is telling us about the situation, right? Because that's never going to go anywhere, right? Because people's perceptions are just so important. And in the last, I don't know how many months, we, all get that sense, right? Sometimes perceptions are more influential than facts and science in terms of, determining people's behaviors, right? So going in with the mentality of, whatever you say, we're here to listen. That's very, very important, rather than going in to tell people you're wrong and here's the science, right? The former is going to be much more effective than the latter, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is actually, Brooke can talk more about this, so I will just briefly mention, is people are always dealing with a suite of stressors, a suite of challenges in their day-to-day lives, right? Conflict with black vulture is one thing, but they're also dealing with, market issues, agriculture inputs problems, supply issues, and relationship with consumers, and different other kinds of regulations, water management, right? So you think about these ranchers, they're kind of constantly addressing problems associated with their production, right? So black vulture conflict is just one part of that. So what can we do to alleviate, reduce people's stress with other challenges in their production may actually increase their tolerance for this particular type of stress with black vulture. That's also something very important, and that's something actually Brooke is working on as a part of her research.
Zhao, you read my mind. One part of this project in the survey as well is understanding that conflicts exist within or one type of concern that producers are dealing with, and understanding where does it fit within those other concerns can be important, because it can allow conservationists and organizations to leverage potentially other concerns to improve tolerance, right? So for example, in one of the other areas I work, there is a project working to protect macaws in a very water stressed area. So if we can improve water accessibility, you have water access to your house, to your crops, that may help you handle the losses, some of the losses associated with tolerance, but also you now associate a good thing with an animal that you didn't have any good experiences with, positive experiences with prior. So I think understanding those other concerns, working with farmers to figure out what those are, and then what are potential solutions that you can address that are within your control, that you can help leverage to improve tolerance is extremely important. And I think as part of that means interacting with farmers and producers at multiple scales. That I think it would be really great to see more conservation agencies and universities work together to bring farmers into the process of developing and, conducting science and understanding data. There's a lot of participatory methods out there that actually allow them to engage with us, assuming they have the time and interest to do so, right? I don't think we should put a burden on them if it's not of interest to them. But then also just talking with them, even when it comes to mitigation measures, right? Sometimes there are lots of mitigations available, but if there's not a trust, or if there's no interest, or there's lack of understanding, these are all social components that conservation agencies and organizations are uniquely situated to address and work with farmers to help figure out what works for you. Why doesn't it work? Why is this uptake not working for you? Is it because your neighbors don't like it? Is it because you can't afford it? You don't understand it? And I think that's something that they can do because they have that connection with local landowners in a way that sometimes scientists or universities even may not have.
That's incredibly helpful to hear. Thanks for all your insights. I really like the idea of being able to do outreach on more than just approaching them about particular problems, because I think that'll just cause further entrenchment on both sides potentially. One thing that we've been considering as an aside is providing outreach and resources that they may not have access to, effigies or sprinkler systems and things they can use to help protect their cattle. Instead of kind of coming at them no, you can't do this. We want to approach them as hey, we know it's scary when a bunch of these birds show up and roost in your trees near your precious livestock. How can we help you protect your calves and cattle? Another thing I've observed too, in terms of the press surrounding Black vultures, is that as they become more visible, and this is not a question that's on the list, so feel free to nix it. As Black vultures become more visible, I feel like there's also a concurrent spike in negative press. And is there anything that conservationists can do to provide a more balanced perspective or help provide a more balanced perspective to kind of counter the exclusively negative publicity of these human wildlife conflicts?
Something that our lab, I think our whole group has had a lot of conversations on, right? The way that vultures are portrayed in the media and conversations, it's a combination. It's kind of one of your prior things about balance, right? Because on the journal side, they want people to be engaged and interested to read it. And sometimes that can lead to catchy titles that often portray the vulture in a more negative light. And so I think, for anyone engaging in media, it can be something as easy as asking to see the title of what you're being quoted in, or requesting that there is a more balanced consideration in how we talk about it, or even producing your own materials, your own news media, or children's books, things that engage younger generations have also been shown to influence attitudes in adults in a positive way. And so I think those are some instances where that can help. And I also think part of the problem with the conflict framing sometimes can be that it is a real conflict for some people, but it may not have been a conflict for other people until they read about that there was a conflict. You know what I mean? There are probably ranchers that had no idea that this was a problem, maybe until they saw that article, and then they themselves became concerned because oh, this is something that's happening. This is something I need to be engaged with. Then now when I see vultures, I may have associated stressors related to them because of what I read. And I think that's something that we should really consider when we talk about how do we talk about these conflicts or as interactions, as potentially negative interactions, without also reinforcing this idea that a conflict's happening for people that may not have thought of it as a conflict, but just as a natural process of living with wildlife on their farms prior to engaging with that media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's really important point, I think, right? Even from the scientific community perspective, the vocabularies we use, plays very important role in shaping people's perceptions, right? So I don't know if you noticed, but in this interview, I try to use the human-wildlife interactions or rancher-vulture interactions, right? I tend to not use the word conflict because the more we say conflict, the more people think it is a conflict, right? Yeah. And in some cases, they're just around. And in fact, ranchers and farmers are quite used to have wildlife around, right? They deal with, coyotes or deer, on a daily basis, right? This is not something new that they've never seen animals other than their livestock on their farm. So talking about it and, normalizing it, right? Talking about it as a neutral interaction rather than negative conflict, I think is also helpful. It's a very small change, but may actually go a long way. Can I just offer another example? It's not about black vulture, but it's about another animal species that my department, Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue, had a really success with, working with. Dr. Rod Williams, he had a program, or maybe still has a program, focusing on hellbenders in Indiana, right? It's also an endangered species. He thinks it's the cutest creature on earth. I would argue maybe a lot of publics may not see it the same way, right? But I didn't even know about it, or didn't really feel any affection towards hellbender just as an individual, right? Until I read about his program and I watched all these cute little cartoons and the extension programs he has put up. And also people dressed up as a hellbender and a hellbender ambassador and going out and communicate with children and in different public events. And I think, positive portrayal of, like Brooke said, right, of these animals, they, it seems catchy, like seems silly, but it does, go a long way.
And I do love on the hellbender that they're called slime puppies. That's a great example of how
that's so cute.
That framing of an animal that's not a very good looking animal, in my opinion, but has been reframed. Mary disagrees with me, but has been reframed in a way that people are like, yeah, it's not traditionally cute, but it's a slime puppy. They're adorable, slimy little salamanders, and they love it. And I think that is a really great success story example of an animal.
Yeah,
that's kind of got to turn around on its narrative.
To end on a positive note, I want to kind of touch on what some of your favorite things about vultures are. If you feel comfortable sharing, or you can even talk about some of your favorite things to come of this research too.
I think one of the things I really like about black vultures is they're very familial. So they actually will spend a long time with their families. Even once they're young or older, they'll sometimes co-roost together or hang out. And I think that's like a very relatable, anthropomorphized almost characteristic, right, for an animal. You can think this is an animal that also is very familiar and hangs out with their family and stays together a bit longer than you see a lot of other wild animals do. And so that's kind of one of my favorite things about black vultures.
Maybe I will jump in too. Before this project, I never really thought about black vultures. I mean, I've seen turkey vultures, but black vulture wasn't on my radar in terms of animals to, look out for. But since this project, I noticed them more, and especially when we travel, sometimes we run into them. And one thing I really love about them is they're not afraid of people, right? You can get really close and they're still just chilling and hanging out. And it's a magnificent feeling that you can be so close to wildlife and they're just so big. And when they open their wings, they're so wide and they're just living next to you, right? And that's, I don't know, for me, that's very wonderful.
For me, what I've liked the most about this project, and it's innate in the fact that it's about black vultures and their interactions with producers. I'll take Zhao's word there. Is the opportunity is presented to get to interact with livestock producers. Earlier in the conversation, I kind of alluded to the fact that part of what black vultures need is a better PR agent. And I think that same message applies to livestock producers and farmers as well. That, like Zhao alluded to, these are people who deal with wildlife on a regular basis, and they are underappreciated, probably misunderstood. And the chance to take on a research project that can help make things better for them and make things better for the research, for the natural world at the same time, has been a really favorite aspect of this work for me. So
yeah, when we got this list of questions, Pat specifically said for that last question, you're not allowed to talk for 18 hours about vultures. I'm just, I'm a huge fan of vultures in general. I think they're really amazing animals. I just think they're the cutest things in the world. They're really endearingly ugly. Their big defense mechanism is vomiting on you. What is not to love about that? They're social and intelligent. They're amazingly efficient flyers. It takes barely more energy for them to be in flight than just to be sitting at a roost, which is just phenomenal to me. Like Zhao said, that these birds have a 5-foot wingspan. Their wingspan is a little bit less than my height. And then you have California condors and griffin vultures with 9-foot wingspans. It's just absolutely phenomenal. The fact that they can eat literally anything, the fact that they have, for so many different cultures, they're really culturally important across the globe, and such a valuable, important part of the ecosystem. And again, they're real cute.